Russia has the GDP of Italy. Let that sink in for a moment. A country with the economic output of a single European nation has convinced the entire Western world that it could end civilization tomorrow. Fear is the cheapest weapon in the Russian arsenal, and it works every single time. Every time Putin speaks, markets tremble, NATO scrambles, news anchors panic, and Moscow smiles. Because the illusion of power is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Fear is the weapon. As Sun Tzu once warned, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Russia didn't just read that line. They built their entire foreign policy around it. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the most sophisticated fear operation in modern history. Every empire in history has understood one fundamental truth. Perception is more powerful than reality. Russia learned this lesson not from textbooks, but from survival. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Moscow found itself broken, bankrupt, and humiliated on the world stage. Their military was rusting. Their economy was in freefall. Their people were starving. But here's what nobody talks about. Instead of rebuilding from the ground up, Russia chose to rebuild the illusion first. Think about that for a moment. While the West measured power in GDP and aircraft carriers, Moscow was investing in something far cheaper and arguably far more effective. They invested in the perception of strength rather than strength itself. Military parades with hardware they couldn't afford to maintain. Hypersonic missile announcements with CGI demonstrations. Submarine deployments timed perfectly to news cycles. As Machiavelli once observed, it is much safer to be feared than loved. If one has to choose, Russia didn't just choose fear. They turned it into an industry. Fear factory, always open. And this factory runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the real question isn't how they built it. It's why it works so well on us. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Not for Russia, for us. Because the numbers tell a story that contradicts everything you've been told. Russia's GDP is roughly $1.8 trillion. That's smaller than Italy, roughly equivalent to Spain, and about 1/10 of the United States. GDP of Italy, their military budget, about $65 billion a year. The Pentagon spends that in a few weeks. Their Navy has one aircraft carrier, and it's so unreliable it travels with a tugboat. One aircraft carrier that needs a tugboat just to stay afloat. Their Air Force flies aging Soviet-era jets that are older than most of their pilots. And their army. Ukraine exposed what years of corruption had done to it. Equipment from the 1970s, soldiers without body armor, communication systems from the Cold War era. So ask yourself this. If these are the real numbers, why does the entire Western world act as if Russia could march into Europe tomorrow? The answer isn't about missiles or tanks. As the political strategist Karl Rove once said in a different context, we're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. Russia took that principle and flipped it. They create their own reality without even having to act. But their most effective weapon isn't conventional at all. Let's talk about the elephant in every room where Russia is discussed. Nuclear weapons. Russia has approximately 6,000 nuclear warheads. That number is real. That capability is genuine. But here's what the fear factory doesn't want you to understand. Having nuclear weapons and being willing to use them are two completely different things. Since 1949, Russia, and before it, the Soviet Union has made over 100 explicit nuclear threats. Not one was carried out. Not during the Korean War. Not during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not during Vietnam. Not during Afghanistan. 1. Korean War 1950. Threatened. Didn't launch. 2. Cuban Crisis 1962. Threatened. Back down. 3. NATO expansion 1999. Threatened. Did nothing. 4. Ukraine 2022. Threatened. Still nothing. Every single time, the threat was the weapon, not the warhead itself. As the strategist Thomas Schelling explained, the power to hurt is bargaining power. To exploit it is diplomacy. If this pattern is opening your eyes, hit like and subscribe to keep exposing what they hide. Because the nuclear fear game is just one card in a much larger deck. Russia's next weapon doesn't even require a military. For decades, Russia had Europe on a leash. Not with missiles, not with soldiers. Gas pipes equal control with gas pipes. At its peak, Russia supplied over 40% of Europe's natural gas. Germany alone depended on Moscow for 55% of its gas imports, and Russia weaponized every cubic meter of it. When Ukraine leaned toward Europe in 2006, Russia cut the gas in the middle of winter. When Georgia challenged Russian influence in 2008, the same thing happened. Turn off the pipes and let them freeze until they comply. The message was elegant in its brutality: cooperate or freeze, and for years it worked perfectly. European leaders knew the threat was real because they had seen it executed before. This wasn't a bluff. This was calculated leverage. An entire continent held hostage by the placement of a single valve. But something changed. As Winston Churchill once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." The 2022 invasion of Ukraine forced Europe to do what decades of warnings couldn't: diversify. And in doing so, they accidentally dismantled one of Russia's most powerful fear tools. But Russia adapted because they always adapt. And their next weapon operates in a space where pipelines are completely irrelevant. If energy was Russia's economic weapon, information became their psychological one. And this weapon costs almost nothing to deploy. The Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg employed hundreds of people whose sole job was to amplify division in Western democracies, not to create the division. That's the key distinction most people miss. They don't create the cracks, they simply pour water into them and wait for winter. During the 2016 US election, Russian operatives ran Facebook groups on both sides of every issue: pro-gun and anti-gun, pro-immigration and anti-immigration. Black lives matter and blue lives matter simultaneously. The goal was never to support one side. Divide, distract, destabilize. The goal was to make Americans distrust each other, and it worked spectacularly well. Studies from Oxford University found that Russian disinformation reached over 126 million Americans on Facebook alone. As the KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov warned back in 1984, ideological subversion changes the perception of reality, so that despite abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions. He said that 40 years ago, and it's playing out exactly as he described. But this playbook isn't new at all. Here's what most people miss entirely. Russia's fear strategy didn't start with Putin. It didn't start with the Soviet Union. It goes back centuries. Ivan the Terrible in the 1500 deliberately cultivated a reputation for extreme cruelty. Not because he was simply mad, but because fear kept the boyars in line and foreign powers at a safe distance. Fear has been official Russian state policy for over 500 years. Peter the Great built an entire city in a swamp, St. Petersburg, specifically to project power toward Europe. Catherine the Great constructed fake villages, the famous Potemkin villages, to impress foreign diplomats with prosperity that didn't exist. Potemkin villages, fake glory. The Soviet Union perfected all of this into an art form. Military parades designed to project strength they didn't always possess. Space achievements timed for maximum psychological impact on the West. Even their losses were spun into propaganda victories. As the historian Robert Conquest once wrote, the Soviet Union was a country where the future was certain. It was the past that kept changing. Today's Russia inherited all of these techniques and upgraded them for the digital age. The faces change, the flags change, but the strategy remains identical across centuries. An understanding that history reveals something critical about today's situation. Here's the uncomfortable part that nobody wants to admit. Russia's fear strategy would be half as effective without willing participants in the West. Complicit. Western media doesn't amplify Russian fear on purpose. It does it for something much simpler: ratings. A headline reading "Russia threatens nuclear strike" gets 10 times more clicks than Russia's economy shrinks again. Every time a news channel shows Russian military footage, Moscow wins without spending a single ruble. Think about how Russia is portrayed in movies, in video games, in television series. Always the unstoppable villain, always the sophisticated threat that keeps the hero awake at night. This cultural programming runs incredibly deep. Hollywood has done more for Russian fear projection than the Kremlin ever could. And it's not just entertainment media either. Defense think tanks in Washington have a direct financial incentive to exaggerate the Russian threat. Bigger threat means bigger budgets. Bigger budgets mean bigger salaries. Bigger threat, bigger budget. As the journalist Upton Sinclair once wrote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. The fear-industrial complex is a perfect feedback loop. Russia projects fear. Western media amplifies it. Defense contractors profit from it. And the cycle continues endlessly. But who exactly is cashing those checks? Follow the money. It's the oldest rule in understanding power. When Russia threatens, defense stocks rise. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, BAE Systems, all of them surge. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO members pledged to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP. That's hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into the military-industrial complex. Defense stocks always rise. And who benefits on Russia's side? Putin and his inner circle. Fear of the West keeps the Russian population loyal and compliant. Fear of Russia keeps Western populations docile and unquestioning. It's a perfect symbiotic relationship between power structures that theoretically oppose each other. Both sides need the other to remain the boogeyman, to justify their own power. As the legendary President Eisenhower warned in his farewell address, in the councils of government, we must guard against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. He said that in 1961. Today, that complex is larger than anything Eisenhower could have imagined in his worst nightmares. And it feeds directly on the fear that Russia so expertly provides. The enemy you need is always more valuable than the enemy you defeat. But here's the thing about strategies built entirely on illusion. Eventually, reality catches up. Ukraine changed everything, not because of what Russia did, but because of what Russia couldn't do. Exposed, the world watched the supposedly second most powerful military on Earth fail to capture Kiev in the opening weeks of its invasion. Tanks running out of fuel on highways. Encrypted communications failing so soldiers used open cell phones that could be intercepted. Logistics so catastrophically poor that troops were looting grocery stores for food. The gap between the myth and the reality was absolutely staggering. The Wagner Group mutiny in 2023 showed cracks in internal loyalty that no amount of propaganda could paper over. Myth versus reality. Russia's demographic crisis means fewer young men available for military service every single year. Technology sanctions have crippled their ability to produce advanced weapons independently. They're pulling microchips from washing machines to put in military equipment. As Napoleon once said, in war, the moral is to the physical, as 3 is to 1. Russia still wields the moral weapon of fear. But the physical reality behind it is eroding faster than at any point since the Soviet collapse. The curtain is falling, and the wizard behind it is far smaller than anyone imagined. And that brings us to the most important question of all. So what do we do with all of this? How does understanding Russia's fear strategy actually change anything in the real world? Fear only works when you don't understand the mechanism behind it. Once you see the machinery, the magic disappears entirely. Now let me be absolutely clear about something. Russia is not a paper tiger. They have real capabilities, real nuclear weapons, and real geopolitical ambitions that affect millions of lives. But they are not the invincible force they've spent decades convincing you they are. The gap between Russia's projected power and its actual power is the largest of any major nation on Earth today. Understanding this gap is the first step toward making better decisions about the world. When you hear the next threat from Moscow, ask yourself 3 simple questions. What do they actually gain from making this threat? What are the real capabilities behind it? And most importantly, who benefits from you being afraid? Question everything, think clearly. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell once wrote, neither a man nor a crowd, nor a nation can be trusted to act humanely under the influence of a great fear. Fear makes us irrational. Fear makes us compliant. And that is precisely why it remains Russia's weapon of choice. Russia's real strategy was never about tanks or missiles or territory. It was about making you believe they had more than they actually do. Every threat, every parade, every hypersonic announcement, every nuclear warning carefully leaked to the press. all part of a centuries-old tradition of projecting strength to compensate for deep vulnerability. Fear is their greatest export. The moment you understand this, you stop reacting with panic and start responding with clarity. And clarity is what power fears most. Not missiles aimed at them, but citizens who see through the performance. An informed mind is immune to manufactured fear. If you made it this far, comment behind the curtain to prove you now see the machinery behind the fear. Every government lies. The question is, what are they lying about?